Hi, my name is Katarina Sullivan and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. I am not in my normal filming location today, and you can tell because there is a real plant in the background and I kill real plants. So yeah, this isn't my house. The owners don't know I'm here. Please no one tell them. Today we are talking about the Governor General, and I think I might have lied last time and said we're talking about the Federal Executive Council, but then I changed my mind because I was like, this isn't going to make sense if we don't talk about the Governor General. In the last How the Australian Political System Works video, we spoke about the Prime Minister, who is our head of government. Today we're speaking about the Governor General, who is essentially acting as our head of state. Our head of state, of course, is Queen Elizabeth II, and the Governor General acts on her behalf in Australia. A little interesting bit of information about how the Prime Minister, Governor General, and Queen kind of work is that the Governor General is appointed by the Queen on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, and then the Prime Minister is appointed by the Governor General. Obviously, there's elections of like a democracy, so it's not just the Governor General choosing the head of government who also chooses the Governor General. But it is kind of a weird little mix that they're sort of appointed in a way by each other. Even though Governor General is appointed by the Queen but advised by the Prime Minister. Our current Governor General is David Hurley, ACDSC, which acronyms because they're fancy. So the Governor General has a few roles, including presiding over the Federal Executive Council, which we'll cover next video because that gets a little bit complicated. He appoints obviously the Prime Minister and also ministers and assistant ministers. So the Governor General also operates in an executive kind of way. So we talked about our three branches of government, which is legislature, executive, and judiciary. And the Governor General helps out with the executive branch. So he facilitates some of the work of some of the government departments that we have. At election time, the Governor General dissolves the Parliament. So the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General and says, time for an election, let's see what the people want. And the Governor General is the one that dissolves Parliament and issues the writs, which calls for the election. The Governor General is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Defence Force. So a little bit different to the United States, in which the President is both the head of government, head of state, and Commander-in-Chief. Our Governor General is actually Commander-in-Chief of the ADF. The Governor General also has some ceremonial duties, so visiting community events, finding members of the community that are doing excellent work, and finding role model Australians to help inspire other Australians and demonstrate the Australian way of life. He also welcomes other head of state visitors to the country and hosts them. So there's a few other things other than just, the being head of state stuff. It's like the fun stuff he does as well. So while we'll cover some of the Federal Executive Council roles more next video, it's important to understand that there is a Federal Executive Council which advises the Governor General on some decisions, including advice on the appointment of federal judges and ambassadors and high commissioners. The Governor General also holds what we call reserve powers, and there's 4 reserve powers that are outlined in the Australian Constitution, and they are basically sort of like a veto in a way. Obviously, they're really the Queen's powers when it comes to the end of the day, because the Governor General is acting on behalf of the Queen, but they are called the Governor General's powers. It's interesting because we talk about Australia as a sovereign nation. We don't really have sovereignty because our head of state comes from a country other than Australia. So we don't have a self-governing ability. And you could argue that it's very rare for the Governor General and the Queen to get involved in political matters, but it has happened before, as we saw in the case of Gough Whitlam. So I'll quickly cover some of the reserve powers and then we'll go into what happened with Gough Whitlam. So the first reserve power is Section 5 of the Constitution, and that is the ability to dissolve Parliament or to refuse to dissolve Parliament. So the Prime Minister might come to the Governor General and say, hey, we want an election. The Governor General has the right to turn around and say, you're not getting one. Very rare that would happen, but it's a possibility. He can also say, hey, I know you haven't called an election yet, but we need one. And that might happen in the case of a hung parliament, where sort of nothing's really passing through and the work of government is stunted. That sort of goes into section 57, which allows the Governor General to dissolve Parliament on the basis of a deadlock. So there's two sections in the Constitution that actually cover sort of the same thing, but that's old documents for you. They like to repeat themselves. Then there's section 58, which is the power to withhold bills for assent. So what that means is when legislation has gone through both the lower and the upper house in identical forms, the bill then goes forward for assent, which means that the Governor General and the Queen essentially sign off on the legislation. The Governor General actually has the power to withhold assent. So that's basically veto power. Is it ever used? Hardly, but it exists. So it's an interesting one. A lot of people don't actually realize that the Governor General has that power, but he or she, we have had female Governor Generals in the past. Currently he does have that power. Section 64 of the Constitution also allows the Governor General to either appoint or dismiss ministers. Again, none of this really happens without the advice of the Prime Minister or other ministers, but it does exist that the Governor General has that power. So in a case where there's been an election and there is no clear majority in the House of Representatives, like neither party is able to form a coalition, neither of the major parties are able to form a coalition, the Governor General has the power to either call for another election or to choose which person becomes Prime Minister. So in that way, we almost don't have a democracy about choosing which party is elected in a case like that. It's very rare that that happens. Usually one party or another is able to form a coalition with minor parties or independent candidates. But it's always important to know what kind of powers do exist in our political system, because we are so lucky that we've had really fantastic Governor Generals forever in Australia. Obviously, there's a lot of people who weren't happy about the Gough Whitlam decision, but for the most part, we've had really reliable, trustworthy Governor Generals. So none of these concerns about our sovereignty or our democracy should be an issue to people, because we have faith in our leaders. Luckily, most of us, anyway. So I briefly want to touch on what happened with Gough Whitlam, because I feel like it deserves its own video entirely, because it was such an unprecedented thing that happened in Australia and something that hasn't really happened again. And I think it's a really great example of how the democratic system can sort of take a bit of a different turn. So basically, Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister. He's a Labor Party Prime Minister, and he lost the confidence of the Parliament. It was a bit tricky because there were people on leave and there's so much information as to how it all happened, but bills weren't getting passed. He lost the confidence of the Parliament, and the Governor General decided that he would remove him as Prime Minister. So it was from there that Governor General Kerr decided to dissolve the Parliament. So it was a bit of a crazy time. If you've ever heard the speech, well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General. That was the first speech that Gough Whitlam gave after the dissolution of the Parliament. It was a very interesting time. There's like alleged CIA involvement. We'll do a whole video on this because it's a really in-depth topic, and I think it just deserves its own thing. But that's when the Governor General can actually step in and change how the Parliament's running. And it has been used before, but as I said earlier, it's not used frequently. So it's not something we need to worry about, but it is something that's really important to be aware of, especially as we're approaching these more and more uncertain times in Australian politics, in our economy, in our environment. in our social progression, and we're seeming to lose confidence of leaders a lot more quickly. We've had such great political instability over the last few years, and it could start being reflected in some of the steps that the Governor General is taking. So it's really important to understand what the powers of the Governor General are. Everything that we've spoken about that the Governor General can and can't do is not necessarily the be all and end all of his powers. There are situations that may arise in the future because of the changing nature of our society that we can't really foresee, but the Governor General will then have powers to do certain things. As new circumstances arise in society, we see lawyers and judges have to make decisions on things that are unprecedented, that we've never seen before, that we don't really know how to respond to in a legal framework. And the same thing will happen with the Constitution. Sometimes there'll be things that come up that we don't really know how to handle, and that will be at the Governor General's discretion on obviously behalf of the Queen. So it's an interesting position in our Australian political system, and one that gets overlooked quite frequently. In the next How the Australian Political System Works video, we'll be covering the Federal Executive Council, and then the one after that, I promise, will be about the Gough Whitlam scenario, so you can get sort of a full overview of the Governor General's role and their powers. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you learned something from this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel. Please follow me on social media. Please do all the wonderful things in life that would help spread the message that I'm trying to get out about how cool Australian politics is, guys. It's not cool, it's a lie. But yeah, didn't really plan this ending properly. I will see you next video. Yeah, cool. I didn't think all the way through this, so cool. Have a good day. Wow, that was lame. No, let's try something different. Have a great day, y'all. No, thank you, and have a great day, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.